Have you ever wondered about the fates of the men who commanded Hitler's war machine? These were not just military leaders, but architects of some of history's most devastating campaigns, men who held the power of life and death over millions. Their stories contain twists of justice, escapes from accountability, and moral complexities that still fascinate historians today. Some faced the hangman's noose, others died in Soviet prisons, while a select few managed to walk free despite their roles in unspeakable crimes. What became of Germany's most powerful military commanders after the Third Reich crumbled into dust? The answers are far more surprising and disturbing than you might imagine. During World War II, German field marshals and generals held the highest military ranks in the Nazi war machine. They were the elite strategists who planned invasions across continents, the tactical geniuses who orchestrated blitzkrieg campaigns that shocked the world, and the commanders who presided over brutal occupations from the Arctic Circle to the North African desert. These men were trusted by Adolf Hitler to execute his vision of conquest and domination, receiving enormous wealth, vast estates, and absolute power over millions of soldiers and civilians alike. However, their authority and prestige ended abruptly with Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. In the chaos that followed, some were captured by American forces in quiet Bavarian villages. Others surrendered to British troops in the ruins of bombed-out cities, and still more fell into the hands of Soviet armies seeking revenge for the horrors unleashed on the Eastern Front. The question that haunted the post-war world was simple but profound. How would these once powerful military leaders face the consequences of their actions? Would justice be served for the millions who died under their commands? In this video, we will find out. So without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Walther von Brauchitsch was born into a Prussian military family on October 4, 1881 in Berlin, following in the footsteps of his forefathers who had built careers serving German monarchs for generations. His father was a cavalry general, and young Walther seemed destined from birth to continue this proud military lineage. He entered military service in 1900. Joining the elite 3rd Guards Field Artillery Regiment, where he quickly distinguished himself as an officer of exceptional promise. During World War I, Brauchitsch served with distinction on both the Western and Eastern fronts, earning the Iron Cross First Class for bravery and demonstrating the tactical acumen that would define his career. After Germany's defeat in 1918, he remained in the drastically reduced Reichswehr, the 100,000-man army permitted under the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Brauchitsch steadily climbed the military hierarchy, becoming known as a master of artillery, tactics, and a meticulous planner who could execute complex operations with precision. His career reached new heights after the Nazis came to power in 1933. As Hitler's rearmament program created opportunities for ambitious officers to advance rapidly through expanding military structures. In 1938, Hitler appointed Brauchitsch as commander-in-chief of the German army, making him one of the most powerful military figures in the Third Reich at the age of 57. This promotion came after Hitler purged several generals he considered insufficiently loyal, replacing them with officers he believed would execute his aggressive foreign policy without question. Brauchitsch's military career was marked by his strategic expertise, especially during the successful blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940 that shocked the world with their speed and ferocity. He oversaw key operations in Poland where German forces crushed Polish resistance in just over a month, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of coordinated tank and air power. In the spring of 1940, Brauchitsch commanded the invasion of France and the Low Countries, witnessing German panzers race through the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes forest and trap hundreds of thousands of Allied troops at Dunkirk. The swift defeat of France in just 6 weeks made him one of the most celebrated military commanders in Europe, praised by Hitler and rewarded with enormous financial gifts totaling hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks. However, despite his early success, his tenure as commander-in-chief was increasingly impaired by his inability to control Adolf Hitler's growing interference in military matters. Hitler, emboldened by rapid victories and convinced of his own military genius, began issuing detailed tactical orders that contradicted the advice of professional officers. Brauchitsch found himself in an impossible position, caught between his duty to provide honest military counsel and his fear of Hitler's volcanic temper. Hitler's micromanagement undermined Brauchitsch's authority, especially during critical campaigns such as the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, which ultimately led to disaster for Germany on the Eastern Front. The invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 22, 1941, under the codename Operation Barbarossa, initially appeared to validate Hitler's strategy as German forces advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, encircling entire Soviet armies and capturing millions of prisoners. Brauchitsch coordinated 3 massive army groups driving towards Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine, convinced that the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. However, as summer turned to autumn, the offensive began to falter. Soviet resistance stiffened, supply lines stretched to breaking point, and the dreaded Russian winter approached. Hitler insisted on continuing offensive operations even as German soldiers froze in inadequate winter clothing, and tanks became immobilized in sub-zero temperatures. Brauchitsch argued for a strategic withdrawal to defensible positions, but Hitler refused, demanding that German forces hold every inch of captured territory regardless of cost. The strain of commanding an increasingly desperate campaign while facing Hitler's rage took a severe toll on Brauchitsch's health. His relationship with Hitler deteriorated as the dictator blamed his generals for the failure to capture Moscow, refusing to acknowledge that his own interference had contributed to the disaster. On November 10, 1941, during a particularly heated confrontation with Hitler over strategy, Brauchitsch suffered a severe heart attack that left him incapacitated for weeks. This health crisis, coupled with the failure of Operation Typhoon, the final desperate attack on Moscow that ground to a halt just miles from the Soviet capital, led to his dismissal by Hitler on December 19, 1941. Hitler himself assumed direct command of the German army, a decision that would prove catastrophic for Germany's military effectiveness. From that point on, Brauchitsch spent the remainder of the war in forced retirement at his estate in Silesia, effectively sidelined from further military involvement and watching from the sidelines as Germany's fortunes declined. The end of the war brought a dramatic shift in Brauchitsch's circumstances that transformed him from a retired field marshal into a war crimes suspect facing potential execution. In May 1945, as Germany collapsed, he fled west to avoid Soviet capture, knowing that his role in Operation Barbarossa made him a prime target for Stalin's vengeance. In August 1945, British forces arrested him in a village in Schleswig-Holstein on charges of war crimes committed during his tenure as Commander-in-Chief. He was held in custody at a detention facility in Münster, Germany, for 3 years, awaiting trial for his actions during the war. British prosecutors built a case against him, documenting his role in transmitting criminal orders, including the notorious Barbarossa Decree that authorized the killing of Soviet political commissars and established brutal occupation policies in the East. However, fate had other plans for the former field marshal. On October 18, 1948, just as he was set to face prosecution at trial, Walther von Brauchitsch died of pneumonia in a Hamburg military hospital at the age of 67. His death before trial raised questions about justice and accountability for high-ranking military leaders after the war, leaving victims without the satisfaction of seeing him answer for his role in one of history's bloodiest conflicts. The man who had once commanded Hitler's armies would never have to stand in a courtroom and account for the millions who died under his command. His widow later admitted that Brauchitsch had accepted substantial secret payments from Hitler, including a 250,000 Reichsmark gift in 1938 and a Silesian estate worth hundreds of thousands of marks, revealing the extent to which high-ranking officers were financially corrupted by the Nazi regime. Moving to our next figure, Maximilian von Weichs had a military career that was characterized by both notable achievements on the battlefield and actions that sparked intense controversy regarding war crimes and civilian atrocities. Born on November 12, 1881, into an aristocratic Bavarian family with deep military traditions, Weichs entered the Bavarian army as a cadet in 1900, beginning a military career that would span nearly half a century. He served as a cavalry officer during World War I, earning a reputation for competence and reliability that carried him through the difficult years of the Weimar Republic. Unlike some of his more politically ambitious colleagues, Weichs maintained a relatively low profile during the 1920s and early 1930s, focusing on his professional duties rather than engaging in political maneuvering. However, his fortunes changed dramatically after Hitler's rearmament program created new opportunities for experienced officers to advance. By 1939, Weichs had risen to command the 13th Corps, positioning him perfectly to play a major role in the coming war. As a field marshal in the German army, he commanded the Second Army during major military campaigns, including the invasions of France in 1940, Yugoslavia in April 1941, and the Soviet Union beginning in June 1941. During the French campaign, his forces broke through Belgian defences and advanced rapidly into northern France, demonstrating the effectiveness of mobile warfare when properly executed. His role in these operations brought him to the forefront of Nazi Germany's war efforts, earning him Hitler's trust and a promotion to General Feldmarschall in February 1943. In 1942, Weichs commanded Army Group B during the disastrous push towards Stalingrad, overseeing not just the ill-fated Sixth Army under Friedrich Paulus, but also supporting operations along the Don River. The collapse of this offensive and the encirclement of Paulus's entire army represented one of Germany's greatest military disasters, though Weichs managed to avoid direct blame by successfully arguing that Hitler's interference had made victory impossible. In 1944, he was appointed commander of the German forces in the Balkans, replacing Alexander Löhr, where his responsibilities included suppressing partisan resistance movements in Yugoslavia and Greece that were tying down hundreds of thousands of German troops desperately needed on other fronts. His tenure in the Balkans was characterized by brutal anti-partisan operations and widespread atrocities against civilians, a reflection of the increasingly desperate measures the German military employed in the later stages of the war. Under his command, German forces and their collaborators carried out mass reprisals against Yugoslav and Greek villages, executing civilians in retaliation for partisan attacks and implementing Hitler's orders for harsh occupation policies. Wehrmacht units under Weichs's authority participated in deportations of Jews and other targeted populations to concentration camps, destroyed entire villages suspected of harboring partisans, and executed thousands of hostages in response to resistance activities. These operations were not spontaneous acts of violence by rogue units, but rather coordinated campaigns approved at the highest levels of command. Weichs retired from his military career on March 25, 1945, as Allied and Soviet forces closed in on Germany from all sides, making his position in the Balkans untenable. He was arrested by American troops in May 1945 at his Bavarian estate, joining hundreds of other high-ranking German officers in Allied custody. The Nuremberg trials, established to bring Nazi war criminals to justice through an unprecedented international legal process, included Weichs among those to be prosecuted for their wartime actions. Specifically, he was scheduled to participate in the U.S. Army's High Command Trial, also known as Case 12, facing charges related to the suppression of partisans in the Balkans and the commission of war crimes against civilian populations. American prosecutors documented numerous atrocities committed by forces under his command, including mass executions of hostages, the destruction of villages, and complicity in the deportation of Greek Jews to Auschwitz. The evidence against Weichs seemed overwhelming, with captured German documents clearly showing his awareness of and involvement in criminal orders. In a surprising turn of events that shocked prosecutors and survivors alike, Weichs was removed from the proceedings in late 1947, before being judged or sentenced. The official reason given was medical reasons, as doctors claimed he was suffering from various ailments that made him unfit to stand trial, a justification that raises ethical questions about accountability for war crimes and whether powerful defendants received preferential treatment. This decision allowed Weichs to evade prosecution despite his alleged involvement in serious wartime atrocities that had killed thousands of civilians. Critics argued that the medical justification was a convenient excuse that allowed an influential defendant to escape justice, particularly since Weichs lived for another 7 years after being declared too ill to stand trial. Maximilian von Weichs died on September 27, 1954, in Bonn, West Germany, at the age of 72, never having faced formal judgment for his actions in Yugoslavia and Greece, leaving victims and their families without the closure that a trial might have provided. Georg von Küchler's military career began early when he joined the German army in 1900 as an artillery officer, entering a military that still bore the martial traditions of the Prussian kingdom. Born on May 30, 1881, in Philippsruhe, Hesse-Nassau, into a military family, Küchler seemed destined for army service from an early age. rising through the ranks during his early career. He gained valuable combat experience during World War I, serving on both the Western and Eastern fronts and distinguishing himself as a capable artillery commander. He continued his service during the interwar years under the Weimar Republic, where he specialized in artillery tactics and became known as an expert in siege warfare and heavy guns. During these difficult years when the German military was limited to just 100,000 men, Küchler's expertise in artillery made him a valuable asset to the reduced Reichswehr. After Hitler came to power in 1933 and began his illegal rearmament program, Küchler's career accelerated rapidly as the expanding Wehrmacht needed experienced officers to train new formations. By 1937, he had risen to command the First Corps in East Prussia, positioning him for a major role in Hitler's planned wars of aggression. Küchler's military career reached its peak during World War II, when he commanded the 18th Army during the invasion of Poland in September 1939, leading his forces in a lightning campaign that crushed Polish resistance in weeks. In 1940, during the invasion of France and the Low Countries, his 18th Army played a crucial role in breaking through Dutch defences, forcing the capitulation of the Netherlands after just 5 days of fighting. His successful campaigns in Poland and France earned him promotions and rewards from Hitler, who valued aggressive commanders who delivered quick victories. In June 1941, Küchler's 18th Army participated in Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union that Hitler believed would destroy the Bolshevik state in a matter of months. Later in the campaign, Küchler took command of Army Group North, responsible for advancing through the Baltic states towards Leningrad, where his forces became bogged down in a brutal siege that would last nearly 900 days. His role in the invasion of the Soviet Union was significant, but it also led to his eventual downfall and placed him at the center of some of the war's worst atrocities. Küchler's actions during the war, particularly his harsh military policies and involvement in war crimes committed against Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, would eventually catch up with him after Germany's defeat. Küchler was promoted to Field Marshal on June 30, 1942, in recognition of his command of Army Group North, making him one of Hitler's most senior military leaders. However, by early 1944, with the Red Army making significant advances following their victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, Küchler found himself unable to stem the Soviet tide. His forces were pushed back from Leningrad after the Soviet Leningrad-Novgorod offensive broke the siege in January 1944, inflicting heavy casualties on Army Group North and threatening to encircle entire German armies. Küchler advocated for a strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions, but Hitler, who had declared a policy of holding every inch of territory, regardless of cost, refused to authorize retreats. On January 29, 1944, after another fierce argument about strategy, Küchler was relieved of his command by Adolf Hitler due to his failure to halt the Soviet counteroffensives and his repeated requests to withdraw to the Panther Line. He was replaced by Walter Model, a ruthless commander who enjoyed Hitler's confidence, but who also ultimately failed to stop the Soviet advance. Küchler retired from professional military duties and spent the final year of the war in forced retirement, watching as Soviet forces drove deeper into German-held territory. During his retirement, von Küchler turned down an invitation to participate in the anti-Hitler resistance movement, choosing to remain loyal to his oath despite growing evidence of German defeat and the criminal nature of the regime he served. At the end of the war, in May 1945, Küchler was arrested by the American Army at his estate in Bavaria, joining thousands of other Wehrmacht officers in Allied custody. Unlike some of his counterparts who died before trial or were released on medical grounds, Küchler faced the full consequences of his actions in a court of law. In the High Command trial, formerly designated as United States of America versus Wilhelm von Leeb et al., which ran from December 30, 1947 to October 28, 1948, he stood accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the Soviet Union during his tenure commanding the 18th Army and Army Group North. The trial revealed the extent of his involvement in Nazi atrocities, including the murder of mentally disabled individuals in occupied territories as part of the T4 euthanasia program, the systematic starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, cooperation with SS Einsatzgruppen, death squads that murdered tens of thousands of Jews in the Baltic states, and the brutal siege of Leningrad that killed an estimated 800,000 civilians through starvation and bombardment. American prosecutors presented captured German documents showing that Küchler had been fully aware of mass murder operations in his area of command, and had in some cases actively facilitated them by providing Wehrmacht troops to assist SS killing operations. During the proceedings, Küchler adopted a defense strategy of admitting to harsh conditions in POW camps, but attributing them primarily to winter conditions, which he described as an act of God beyond his control, a claim that prosecutors found both callous and dishonest. He also claimed that the army exaggerated POW mortality rates to receive more supplies from Berlin, essentially arguing that the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners were a statistical manipulation rather than a deliberate policy of extermination through starvation and exposure. Despite these attempts to mitigate his responsibility and shift blame to circumstances beyond his control, the court found him guilty on 2 of 4 counts, specifically for his role in the starvation and murder of Soviet POWs and his complicity in allowing his forces to cooperate with SS execution squads. Küchler's conviction resulted in a 20-year prison sentence handed down on October 28, 1948, a term that many survivors felt was far too lenient given the scale of atrocities committed under his command. However, even this reduced sentence was not fully served. His time behind bars was shortened when his sentence was reviewed and reduced to 12 years in 1951 as part of a broader clemency policy influenced by the emerging Cold War, as American authorities began to view German military expertise as potentially useful against the Soviet threat. In February 1953, Küchler was released from Landsberg prison, having served less than a decade for crimes that contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. He was released and went on to live quietly with his wife in the Garmisch-Partenkirchen region of Bavaria, enjoying the mountain scenery and alpine air. He maintained contact with other former Wehrmacht officers and remained unrepentant about his wartime service, insisting until his death that he had merely been a soldier following orders and that the atrocities in his command area were either exaggerated by Allied propaganda or committed by the SS without his knowledge, claims that historians have thoroughly debunked through examination of German wartime documents. Küchler passed away in Garmisch-Partenkirchen on May 25, 1968, at the age of 86. Having lived a comfortable retirement that his victims never had the chance to experience. Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb was a career military officer who began his service in the Bavarian army in 1895, entering a military establishment that still maintained distinct regional identities within the German Empire. Born on September 5, 1876, in Passau, Bavaria, Leeb came from a middle-class family without the aristocratic military traditions that characterized many of his contemporaries. He rose through the ranks. During World War I, where he distinguished himself as a capable artillery officer and staff planner, earning several medals for his service on the Western Front. His exemplary service earned him prestigious decorations, including the Military Order of Max Joseph in 1917, Bavaria's highest military honor, which granted him a noble title and the right to add Ritter, Knight, to his name. As a result, Leeb's surname was changed to Ritter von Leeb, elevating his social status and marking him as a member of Bavaria's military nobility. After Germany's defeat in 1918, Leeb remained in the Reichswehr, becoming one of the army's leading theorists on defensive warfare and fortifications. During the 1920s and early 1930s, he wrote influential military treatises, arguing that defense was inherently stronger than offense, views that would later put him at odds with Hitler's aggressive military strategy. In 1938, Leeb opposed Hitler's plans to invade Czechoslovakia, arguing that Germany was not ready for war and that the French Maginot Line would be impossible to break through, views that nearly ended his career. However, Hitler's successful annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland without firing a shot vindicated the Führer's aggressive approach and marginalized cautious officers like Leeb. Despite his reservations about Nazi foreign policy, Leeb remained in service and was given command of Army Group C for the invasion of France in May 1940. Leeb commanded Army Group C during the invasion of France in 1940, though his forces played a supporting role to the main thrust through the Ardennes. His army group was responsible for pinning down French forces along the Maginot Line while other German armies executed the decisive flanking maneuver that trapped Allied armies in Belgium. Although his role was less glamorous than leading panzer spearheads, Leeb performed his mission effectively, preventing French forces from redeploying to counter the German breakthrough. His success in this campaign earned him a promotion to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940, making him one of a dozen officers elevated to Germany's highest military rank in the euphoria following France's defeat. The promotion came with substantial financial rewards, including a 250,000 Reichsmark gift from Hitler and the promise of an estate in conquered territory, payments that were secretly channeled through special accounts to avoid publicity about how generously Hitler rewarded his generals. On March 30th, 1941, Leeb was among over 200 senior military officers who attended a speech delivered by Adolf Hitler at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. A gathering that would prove historically significant for what it revealed about Wehrmacht complicity in Nazi crimes. In this address, Hitler detailed his vision for an ideological war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, explicitly stating that the coming campaign would not follow conventional rules of warfare, but would instead be a racial struggle to destroy Judeo-Bolshevism. Hitler announced that political commissars attached to Soviet military units were to be shot immediately upon capture, that civilians could be executed for resistance without trial, and that German forces should show no mercy to Slavic peoples who Hitler characterized as subhuman. The fact that Leeb and other senior officers raised no objections to these clearly criminal orders would later be used as evidence of Wehrmacht complicity in Nazi war crimes. During Operation Barbarossa, which commenced on June 22, 1941, Leeb was assigned to lead Army Group North with a mission to advance through the Baltic states and capture the strategic city of Leningrad. His forces advanced rapidly through Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, covering hundreds of miles in the first weeks of the campaign and reaching the outskirts of Leningrad by September 1941. However, Hitler's decision to divert mobile forces south to assist in the encirclement of Kiev meant that Leeb lacked the strength for a direct assault on the city. Instead, Army Group North began a siege that would become one of history's longest and deadliest, ultimately killing an estimated 800,000 civilians through starvation and bombardment. His forces were implicated in war crimes against civilians during the advance and siege, cooperating closely with SS Einsatzgruppen, death squads responsible for mass executions of Jews, communists, and other targeted populations. Wehrmacht units under Leeb's command provided logistical support, armed guards, and in some cases, direct participation in massacres that killed tens of thousands of civilians in the Baltic states. Leeb was also involved in transmitting the Barbarossa Decree, also known as the Commissar Order, which authorized the killing of Soviet political commissars and harsh treatment of Soviet prisoners of war who were to be denied the protections normally accorded to POWs under international law. Documents captured after the war showed that Leeb's headquarters had distributed these criminal orders down the chain of command, making Army Group North complicit in systematic violations of the laws of war. Wehrmacht forces under his command participated in the deliberate starvation of Leningrad's civilian population, refusing to allow food convoys to enter the city and firing on civilians attempting to evacuate, actions that prosecutors would later characterize as genocide. On January 15, 1942, frustrated by Hitler's refusal to authorize a strategic withdrawal from the increasingly untenable position around Leningrad, and exhausted by months of brutal fighting in sub-zero temperatures, Leeb requested that Hitler either grant him autonomy in his command or relieve him of his duties. He argued that the siege was consuming resources needed elsewhere and that his forces risked encirclement if Soviet counteroffensives broke through the overstretched German lines. Hitler, who viewed any withdrawal as defeatism and cowardice, chose to relieve Leeb from command rather than grant him operational freedom. Georg von Küchler took over as commander of Army Group North on January 16, 1942, inheriting a difficult tactical situation that would only deteriorate over the following 2 years. Leeb was never given another command by Hitler, who had lost confidence in the field marshal's willingness to execute orders without question. He spent the remainder of the war in retirement at his Bavarian estate, increasingly critical of Hitler's leadership, but unwilling to join the resistance movement that would culminate in the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt. After Germany's surrender, Leeb was arrested by American forces and faced prosecution in the High Command trial. Despite serious allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity related to his command of Army Group North, Leeb's trial resulted in a surprisingly lenient sentence that shocked prosecutors and survivors. His defense attorney, a skilled American lawyer named Hans Lattenser, who represented multiple defendants in the High Command trial, portrayed him as a humane soldier who had not personally seen or transmitted criminal orders, arguing that the actions of his troops were a result of battlefield conditions and military necessity rather than criminal policy. Lattenser emphasized Leeb's reputation as a defensive warfare theorist and his conflicts with Hitler over strategy, painting him as a reluctant participant in Nazi aggression. The court convicted Leeb of transmitting the Barbarossa Decree and its criminal application by subordinate units, finding that he bore command responsibility for war crimes committed by forces under his authority. However, on October 28, 1948, he received only a 3-year imprisonment sentence, which was effectively time served since he had been in custody since 1945. The judgment stated that no criminal order has been introduced into evidence that bears his signature or stamp of his approval, finding that many historians have challenged by pointing to documents showing Leeb's headquarters distributed criminal orders throughout Army Group North. The tribunal essentially accepted Leeb's argument that he had opposed Hitler's criminal policies, but had been powerless to prevent their implementation, a defense that set a troubling precedent for other defendants. Leeb's case exemplifies the complexities and controversies of post-war trials, where some high-ranking officers received minimal punishment for their participation in massive crimes. This lenient outcome potentially undermined the principles of accountability and reconciliation that the trials were meant to uphold, sending a message that senior commanders could escape serious consequences by distancing themselves from orders they had helped implement. It's worth noting that despite his light sentence, Leeb had received substantial financial benefits from the Nazi regime, benefits that were never confiscated or returned. To victims, these included secret gifts of 250,000 Reichsmarks in 1940, approximately equivalent to several $1 million in modern currency, and a Silesian estate valued at 660,000 Reichsmarks that was seized from its Polish owners and given to Leeb as a reward for his service. These payments, documented in captured Nazi financial records, indicated a level of complicity and reward for his loyalty to the regime that contradicted his claims of having been a reluctant participant in Hitler's wars. After Leeb was released from prison in 1948, having served barely any additional time beyond his pre-trial detention, he went back to his estate in Hohenschwangau, Bavaria, where he lived comfortably on his military pension and the proceeds from his wartime rewards. He remained unrepentant about his wartime service and maintained contact with other former Wehrmacht officers who shared his view that they had been unjustly prosecuted for doing their duty. Leeb passed away following a heart attack on April 29, 1956, at the age of 79, having spent his final years enjoying Bavarian mountain scenery and receiving visits from former comrades who viewed him as a victim of victor's justice, rather than a war criminal who had escaped appropriate punishment. Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist came from a family with a long and distinguished history of military service stretching back centuries to the days of Prussian kings. Born on August 8, 1881 in Braunfels, in the Prussian province of Hesse-Nassau, Kleist entered military service at age 19, joining the prestigious Hussars Cavalry Regiment in 1900. His early career spanned both World War I and the interwar period, during which he established himself as a competent officer with expertise in mobile warfare tactics. Von Kleist was particularly recognized for his leadership during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns that demonstrated the devastating potential of coordinated tank and air operations. Unlike some of his contemporaries who had to adapt to mechanized warfare, Kleist embraced the new tactics enthusiastically, recognizing that tanks and aircraft had fundamentally transformed the nature of combat. He commanded the 1st Panzer Group during the invasion of France in 1940, leading a fast-moving armoured thrust that penetrated deep into French defences through the Ardennes forest, an operation that Allied commanders had believed impossible for large tank formations. His panzer divisions raced westward, covering distances in days that would have taken weeks in World War I, cutting off Allied armies in Belgium and contributing to a swift German victory that shocked the world. The French campaign made Kleist's reputation as one of Germany's most capable armoured commanders, earning him Hitler's praise and rapid promotion. In June 1941, Kleist was involved in Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union that Hitler believed would destroy the communist state in a matter of months. Commanding the 1st Panzer, Army, now enlarged to include multiple panzer and motorized divisions, he led some of the largest tank battles in history up to that point, engagements involving thousands of armored vehicles across fronts stretching hundreds of miles. His forces participated in the encirclement of Soviet forces at Uman in late July 1941, trapping 2 Soviet armies and capturing approximately 100,000 prisoners, and the much larger encirclement at Kiev in September 1941, which resulted in the capture of over 600,000 Soviet soldiers in what remains one of history's largest military encirclements. These operations inflicted massive losses on the Red Army and contributed to the initial German advance deep into Soviet territory, bringing Wehrmacht forces within striking distance of Moscow by December 1941. However, Kleist's campaigns in the Soviet Union also revealed the limits of German military strategy, as logistical challenges became increasingly severe the deeper his forces advanced into the vast Soviet interior. Supply lines stretched to breaking point, mechanical breakdowns increased due to poor road conditions and extreme weather, and the harsh Russian winter eventually stalled the German offensive, turning Hitler's expected quick victory into a prolonged war of attrition that Germany could not win. Kleist himself later acknowledged that the invasion had been a strategic mistake, though he made these admissions only after Germany's defeat. Kleist's career took a significant turn in 1942 when he was appointed commander of Army Group A during the German summer offensive into the Caucasus region, an operation codenamed Case Blue that aimed to capture Soviet oil fields and knock the Soviet Union out of the war by depriving it of fuel. His forces were tasked with advancing hundreds of miles across the southern Russian steppes to capture the vital oil fields around Baku on the Caspian Sea, resources that Germany desperately needed to continue the war. The campaign initially showed promise as German forces advanced rapidly across open terrain, but it soon faltered due to the overextension of German resources and the fierce Soviet resistance that stiffened as defenders fought to protect strategically vital territory. Kleist's Army Group A advanced to the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains and even planted the German flag on Mount Elbrus, Europe's highest peak, in a symbolic gesture, but it never came close to capturing the oil fields that were the operation's objective. Meanwhile, the parallel German offensive towards Stalingrad to the north turned into a disaster as Soviet forces encircled the entire German Sixth Army in November 1942. By early 1943, with the disaster at Stalingrad unfolding and Soviet forces launching counteroffensives across the southern front, the Germans were forced to retreat from the Caucasus to avoid being cut off and surrounded themselves. This retreat marked a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front, as German forces went permanently on the defensive and never again launched a successful strategic offensive in the East. On March 30th, 1944, after a series of retreats and failures to halt Soviet advances following the disaster at the Battle of Kursk, Kleist was dismissed by Hitler, who increasingly distrusted his military commanders and blamed them for failures caused by his own strategic incompetence. Hitler had grown paranoid about betrayal within the officer corps and saw defeatism in any general who suggested strategic withdrawals or questioned unrealistic offensive plans. Kleist was succeeded by Ferdinand Schörner, a ruthless Nazi fanatic known for his brutal treatment of his own soldiers and his willingness to execute officers and men who showed any signs of defeatism. Following the unsuccessful attempt to assassinate Hitler on July 20th, 1944, known as the 20 July Plot or Operation Valkyrie, when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb at Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, the Gestapo launched a massive investigation into the conspiracy that eventually implicated hundreds of officers. Kleist was arrested in late 1944 because his cousin, Ewald Heinrich von Kleist Schmenzin, had been involved in the Oster conspiracy, an earlier resistance plot against Hitler. The Gestapo subjected Kleist to interrogation about his knowledge of resistance activities, though he apparently convinced his interrogators that he had been unaware of his cousin's activities. Despite the arrest and the cloud of suspicion, Kleist managed to avoid trial, likely because prosecutors lacked evidence of his direct involvement in any conspiracy, and was subsequently released in early 1945 as the Nazi regime focused its remaining energy on the deteriorating military situation rather than pursuing questionable prosecutions. After the war ended in May 1945, von Kleist was captured by Allied forces in the chaotic final days of the Third Reich as he attempted to reach American lines rather than fall into Soviet hands. However, the Western Allies handed him over to Yugoslavia in 1946, where Marshal Tito's communist government was prosecuting German officers for war crimes committed during the brutal occupation of Yugoslavia. Kleist was sentenced to 15 years in prison for war crimes related to his force's participation in anti-partisan operations in the Balkans, operations that had involved mass reprisals against civilians and the destruction of entire villages suspected of supporting resistance fighters. After serving part of his sentence in Yugoslav prisons, he was extradited to the Soviet Union in 1948, where he faced additional prosecution for war crimes related to his commands on the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa and the Caucasus Campaign. Soviet prosecutors charged him with responsibility for mass murder of civilians, mistreatment of Soviet prisoners of war, and complicity in SS operations in areas under his military control. Kleist was tried by a Soviet military tribunal and sentenced to 25 years in a correctional labor camp, one of the harshest sentences imposed on captured German generals. Soviet authorities never considered early release for Kleist, despite his advancing age and deteriorating health, viewing him as too important a war criminal to show mercy. Kleist's final years were spent in harsh Soviet captivity under conditions that broke the health of even young prisoners. On November 13, 1954, he died of heart failure while imprisoned at Vladimir Central Prison, a facility about 200 kilometers east of Moscow that housed particularly important political prisoners and war criminals. He was 73 years old at the time of his death, having spent nearly a decade in Soviet captivity under brutal conditions. His death made him one of the highest-ranking German officers to die in Soviet custody, joining a number of other field marshals and generals who never returned from Stalin's camps. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were released in the 1950s as part of Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's negotiations with the Soviet Union, Kleist was never considered for amnesty due to the severity of crimes committed by forces under his command. His widow never received confirmation of his death until years later, as Soviet authorities did not routinely notify German families about prisoners who died in custody. Kleist's fate stands in stark contrast to the relatively lenient treatment received by some other German commanders, demonstrating that the consequences for war crimes varied dramatically depending on which Allied power held custody of the accused. Wilhelm List's military career began during the final years of the German Empire when he joined the Bavarian army as an officer cadet in 1898 at the age of 18. Born on May 14, 1880, in Oberkirchberg, Kingdom of Württemberg, List came from a middle-class family without military traditions, making his rise to Field Marshal all the more remarkable. He served with distinction during World War I as a staff officer, demonstrating the organizational and planning skills that would characterize his later career. After the First World War, like many career officers, Wilhelm List remained in the drastically reduced Reichswehr, the 100,000-man military force permitted to Germany under the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles. During the difficult years of the Weimar Republic, List worked to modernize Germany's military under severe limitations, helping to develop the tactical doctrines and officer training programs that would later be employed during World War II. His expertise in staff work and operational planning made him valuable, despite the restricted size of the German military establishment. With the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, List played a key role in the German invasion of Poland, commanding the 14th Army that advanced from German-held territory in Silesia and Slovakia. His forces broke through Polish defences and rapidly advanced deep into Polish territory, participating in the encirclement of Polish armies and contributing to Poland's defeat in just over a month. His success in this operation, where he demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated armour and infantry operations, earned him Hitler's favour and marked him as one of the Führer's most trusted commanders. By 1940, List was promoted to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940, as part of the mass promotion of generals following the stunning German victory over France, making him one of a dozen officers elevated to Germany's highest military rank in recognition of their roles in the successful campaigns of 1939 and 1940. One of List's most notable assignments was leading German forces during the Balkan Campaign in 1941, operations that would later become central to his war crimes prosecution. He commanded the 12th Army and Army Group A, which were crucial formations in the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941. Operations launched because Hitler needed to secure Germany's southern flank before invading the Soviet Union. List's forces attacked Yugoslavia from Bulgaria and quickly overwhelmed Yugoslav defences, which had been weakened by internal political divisions and inadequate preparations for modern warfare. The Yugoslav army, still organised along World War I lines and lacking modern equipment, collapsed within days despite fierce resistance from some units. German forces occupied Belgrade after a brutal aerial bombardment that killed thousands of civilians, an attack that List later claimed was necessary to break Yugoslav resistance. His armies then pushed into Greece, joining forces already engaged against Greek and British Commonwealth troops in a campaign that drove Allied forces from the Greek mainland within weeks. These rapid victories demonstrated List's skill at coordinating large-scale operations across difficult terrain, but they also began his association with war crimes. However, List's involvement in the Balkans also connects him to the darker aspects of the war that would haunt him after Germany's defeat. The region saw brutal repression, mass executions and harsh reprisals against partisans and civilians as German occupation authorities attempted to suppress resistance movements. While the extent of List's personal involvement in these atrocities has been debated by historians, his position as a commanding officer inevitably links him to the war crimes committed by German forces under his command, as international law holds commanders responsible for criminal acts committed by their subordinates if they knew or should have known about them and failed to prevent or punish them. Wehrmacht units under List's authority participated in mass reprisal killings, where German forces executed dozens or hundreds of civilians for every German soldier killed by partisans, a practice that violated the laws of war and constituted collective punishment prohibited by the Hague Conventions. Documents captured after the war showed that List's headquarters had approved and in some cases ordered these reprisals, making him directly complicit in war crimes that killed thousands of Yugoslav and Greek civilians. German forces under his command destroyed entire villages suspected of harbouring partisans, burning homes and executing male inhabitants without any attempt to distinguish between resistance fighters and innocent civilians. These operations, often carried out under the pretext of anti-partisan warfare, were in reality campaigns of terror designed to intimidate occupied populations and suppress any resistance to German rule. List's forces also participated in the deportation of Jews from Greece to concentration camps, providing troops and transportation for SS operations that sent tens of thousands of Greek Jews to Auschwitz, where most were murdered in gas chambers. Historians have documented that Wehrmacht units under List's command cooperated closely with SS and police units, carrying out the Holocaust in the Balkans, providing logistical support, armed guards for deportation transports, and in some cases, direct participation in massacres. In 1942, List's career ended abruptly during Case Blue, the German summer offensive on the Eastern Front that aimed to capture Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus and knock the Soviet Union out of the war by depriving it of fuel. Tasked with capturing the vital oil fields in the Caucasus region, List commanded Army Group A in what was supposed to be a decisive campaign. His forces advanced rapidly across the southern Russian steppes, but soon faced severe logistical challenges and strong Soviet resistance that slowed the offensive to a crawl. The distances involved were vast, supply lines stretched to impossible lengths, and Soviet forces fought with desperate determination to protect territory vital to their war effort. When the operation faltered in late summer 1942, failing to reach its objectives and leaving German forces dangerously overextended, Hitler blamed List for the failure, despite having personally interfered in the campaign's execution by constantly changing objectives and diverting forces. On September 9, 1942, after a series of heated arguments about strategy and Hitler's unrealistic demands for continued offensive operations, Hitler dismissed List from command in a rage. The dismissal came after List had requested permission to withdraw some units to more defensible positions, a request that Hitler interpreted as defeatism and cowardice. After his dismissal, List never returned to active duty, spending the remainder of the war in forced retirement at his Bavarian estate. He watched from the sidelines as Germany's military situation deteriorated. The tide of war turned irreversibly against the Third Reich, and the dreams of conquest that had motivated his generation of officers crumbled into defeat and disgrace. List was arrested by Allied forces in May 1945 as American troops swept through Bavaria in the final days of the war, capturing thousands of German officers who had thought they might escape accountability. He was held in custody for several years while Allied prosecutors built cases against high-ranking German commanders accused of war crimes. List was eventually tried in the hostages trial, officially known as United States of America versus Wilhelm List et alii, where German generals were prosecuted specifically for war crimes committed in Southeast Europe, particularly in Yugoslavia and Greece. The trial, which ran from July 8, 1947 to February 19, 1948, focused on the brutal anti-partisan campaigns and reprisal killings that had characterized German occupation policy in the Balkans. Prosecutors presented extensive evidence of List's role in ordering and approving mass executions of civilians, destruction of villages, and cooperation with SS units carrying out genocidal operations. Documents bearing List's signature authorized specific reprisal. Operations approved execution quotas of 100 hostages for every German soldier killed and praised subordinate units for their ruthlessness in suppressing resistance. List was sentenced to life imprisonment on February 19, 1948. After being convicted on multiple counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, a verdict that reflected the tribunal's finding that he bore command responsibility for atrocities that killed tens of thousands of civilians. The court rejected his defense arguments that he had merely been following orders from Berlin and had been unaware of the full extent of atrocities committed by his forces, finding that, as a field marshal and army group commander, he had clear responsibility for the actions of units under his authority. However, List's life sentence proved to be largely symbolic, as Cold War political considerations began to influence Allied policy towards imprisoned German officers. He was released from Landsberg prison in 1953 due to ill health, having served less than 5 years of his life sentence, as American authorities adopted a more lenient approach to German war criminals in the context of recruiting West Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union. The decision to release List provoked outrage from Yugoslav and Greek survivors who felt that justice had been betrayed, but American authorities justified the decision by citing medical reports claiming List was gravely ill and unlikely to live much longer, reports that proved to be premature. However, far from being at death's door, List continued to live for 19 more years after his release, enjoying a comfortable retirement in Bavaria, supported by his military pension, and living to see the economic miracle of West Germany's reconstruction. He maintained contact with other former Wehrmacht officers and participated in veterans organizations that promoted the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. The false narrative that regular German military forces had fought honorably, while only the SS committed atrocities. List never expressed remorse for his wartime actions or acknowledged the suffering of his victims, instead insisting until his death that he had been a professional soldier who had served his country honorably. He passed away on August 17, 1971, at the age of 91, having outlived most of his victims and many of his fellow officers, his longevity standing in bitter contrast to the thousands who died on his orders or under his command. Another figure whose career trajectory took him from the heights of military power to the depths of imprisonment was Karl Dönitz, a pivotal figure in naval history during World War II, whose unique path set him apart from the army commanders we have examined so far. Born on September 16, 1891, in Grunau, Berlin, Dönitz came from a middle-class family and chose a naval career at a time when Germany's high seas fleet was challenging British naval supremacy. He joined the Imperial German Navy in 1910 and served during World War I, initially on surface ships before transferring to the U-boat service in 1916. His U-boat was sunk in October 1918 by British forces in the Mediterranean, and Dönitz spent the remainder of World War I as a prisoner of war in British camps, an experience that left him with a lasting bitterness towards Britain. After the war, Dönitz remained in the tiny navy permitted to Germany under the Treaty of Versailles, slowly rebuilding his career during the difficult years of the Weimar Republic. When Hitler came to power and began illegal rearmament, including the secret construction of submarines in violation of the Versailles Treaty, Dönitz was placed in charge of the new U-boat force in 1935, a position that would define the rest of his career. He commanded the U-boat fleet of the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, igniting a fierce battle in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean that would become known as the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, as he rose to the rank of Grand Admiral, succeeding Erich Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy in January 1943. Dönitz posed a formidable threat to Allied naval forces and the vital convoy system that kept Britain supplied and able to continue the war. From 1939 to 1943, his U-boats dominated the Atlantic shipping lanes, sinking millions of tons of Allied merchant shipping and threatening to cut Britain's lifeline to North America. Dönitz developed the Wolfpack tactics that allowed multiple submarines to coordinate attacks on Allied convoys, overwhelming their escorts and sinking numerous ships before withdrawing. These tactics proved devastatingly effective, particularly in 1941 and early 1942, when German submarines operated along the American East Coast with minimal opposition, a period U-boat crews called the Second Happy Time. However, the tides of advantage shifted decisively in May 1943, a month that became known as Black May in the Kriegsmarine as Allied technological innovations and increased numbers of escort vessels turned the Battle of the Atlantic against the U-boats. The introduction of improved radar, long-range aircraft that could cover the mid-Atlantic gap, escort carriers that provided air cover for convoys, and breaking of German naval codes allowed Allied forces to hunt down and destroy U-boats faster than Germany could build replacements. U-boat losses in May 1943 were so catastrophic, with 43 submarines sunk in a single month, that Dönitz was forced to temporarily withdraw his boats from the North Atlantic, effectively conceding defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic, even though the U-boat war continued at reduced intensity until May 1945. The most controversial and historically significant phase of Dönitz's career came in the chaotic final days of the Third Reich, when he suddenly found himself thrust into political leadership. After Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in on the Reich Chancellery, Dönitz was shocked to learn that the Führer had designated him as his successor as head of state. Hitler's last political testament, written hours before his death, appointed Dönitz as Reich President and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, passing over more senior Nazi officials like Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, whom Hitler believed had betrayed him. Dönitz succeeded Hitler as head of state in what was initially called the Goebbels cabinet, though Joseph Goebbels himself committed suicide the day after Hitler, which later transformed into the Flensburg government, named after the northern German city where Dönitz established his headquarters. For 3 weeks in May 1945, Dönitz nominally governed what remained of Nazi Germany, though his authority extended only over shrinking pockets of German-held territory, as Allied and Soviet forces completed the occupation of the country. In a momentous turn of events that formally ended World War II in Europe, Dönitz directed the signing of Germany's unconditional surrender to the Western Allies on May 7, 1945, at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France, and to the Soviet Union on May 8, 1945, in Berlin, effectively marking the end of the war in Europe. Dönitz continued to serve as the nominal president of Germany and the supreme commander of the armed forces until May 23, 1945, when the dissolution of his government and cabinet occurred as Allied powers arrested his entire administration and assumed complete control of Germany. Notably, Dönitz's controversial affiliation with the Nazi Party, which he had joined in 1944, and his unwavering support for Hitler, even after the Führer's death, cast a dark shadow over his legacy and made him a target for prosecution. Unlike some Wehrmacht officers who claimed to have opposed the Nazi regime or to have been apolitical soldiers merely doing their duty, Dönitz was an enthusiastic Nazi who had endorsed Hitler's racial ideology and had transmitted Hitler's infamous Laconia Order, which prohibited U-boats from rescuing survivors of torpedoed ships, a directive that resulted in the deaths of thousands of merchant seamen and passengers. He was tried as a major war criminal at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the main trial of top Nazi leaders, where he faced charges alongside Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and other architects of Nazi Germany's crimes. At the trial, which ran from November 1945 to October 1946, Dönitz faced charges of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. prosecutors presented evidence of Dönitz's role in planning Germany's aggressive wars, his implementation of unrestricted submarine warfare that violated international law, and his enthusiastic support for Nazi ideology, including transmitting Hitler's political messages to military forces. While he was acquitted of the most serious charge of crimes against humanity, largely because prosecutors could not directly link him to Holocaust operations or mass murder of civilians, he was found guilty of crimes against peace and war crimes related to his conduct of submarine warfare and treatment of prisoners. The tribunal sentenced him to 10 years imprisonment on October 1, 1946, a relatively lenient sentence compared to the death sentences or life imprisonment given to many other defendants, though prosecutors had sought a longer sentence, arguing that Dönitz's role in prolonging the war had resulted in unnecessary deaths. Dönitz served his sentence in Berlin's Spandau prison, the specially constructed facility that housed the 7 Nuremberg defendants who received prison sentences rather than execution. He proved to be a difficult prisoner, maintaining his loyalty to Hitler and Nazi ideology throughout his incarceration and refusing to express remorse for Germany's war or acknowledge the criminality of the regime he had served. Unlike Albert Speer, another Spandau inmate who adopted a pose of repentance and became known as the Nazi who said sorry, Dönitz remained defiant and unrepentant, insisting that he had merely done his duty as a soldier. After his release on October 1, 1956, after serving every day of his 10-year sentence as authorities rejected clemency appeals, Dönitz relocated to a small town called Aumühle near Hamburg, where he lived quietly on his naval pension and proceeds from writing. A few years later, in 1958, he published his autobiography titled Memoirs, 10 Years and 20 Days, a self-serving account that passionately claimed that he had no knowledge of Hitler's crimes, particularly the Holocaust, and that he had simply been a naval officer focused on military operations. The book became a bestseller in Germany, appealing to those who wanted to believe in the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, though historians have thoroughly debunked Dönitz's claims of ignorance and pointed to his documented enthusiasm for Nazi ideology. He remained active in naval veterans circles and received visits from former U-boat commanders who continued to view him as their leader. Dönitz passed away on December 24, 1980, at the age of 89 after a prolonged illness, dying in his home surrounded by family, having lived long enough to see Germany reunified economically, if not politically, and the Kriegsmarine veterans associations he supported achieved some measure of social rehabilitation in West German society. Gerd von Rundstedt represented the old Prussian military aristocracy at its most traditional and professional, a field marshal who embodied the conservative values of the pre-Nazi officer corps even as he served Hitler's regime. Born on December 12, 1875, in Aschersleben, province of Saxony, into an ancient Junker family with military traditions stretching back centuries, Rundstedt seemed destined from birth to become a Prussian officer. He entered military service in 1892 at Auschwitz, the age of 16, joining the 83rd Infantry Regiment and beginning a military career that would span more than half a century and 2 world wars. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt started his career serving as a staff officer during World War I, where he demonstrated the meticulous planning and organizational skills that would characterize his entire career. He served primarily in staff positions during the First World War, rather than commanding troops in the trenches, working on operational planning at army and corps level. His military career extended into the period between the 2 world wars, a difficult time when the German military was reduced to a fraction of its former size under the Treaty of Versailles. During these interwar years, Rundstedt was instrumental in secretly maintaining German military capabilities despite treaty restrictions, helping to preserve tactical doctrines and officer training programs that would later be employed in World War II. His expertise and seniority allowed him to reach the rank of Colonel General in 1938, commanding Military District 3 in Berlin, making him one of the Wehrmacht's most senior officers when Hitler came to power. However, despite reaching this elevated position, Rundstedt found himself in conflict with Hitler's aggressive foreign policy and retired from active service in October 1938, ostensibly due to his age but actually because he opposed Hitler's plans to invade Czechoslovakia. He believed Germany was not ready for war and that Hitler's reckless diplomacy risked catastrophe for Germany. This retirement proved short-lived as Hitler's successful annexation of Czechoslovakia without war vindicated the Führer's approach and humiliated cautious officers like Rundstedt. When World War II erupted in September 1939, Hitler recalled Rundstedt to active duty despite their previous disagreements, recognizing that the Wehrmacht needed its most experienced commanders for the coming campaigns. Rundstedt was called back too, duty to lead Army Group South during the Polish invasion, commanding the forces that advanced from German-held Silesia and Slovakia into southern Poland. His army group encircled Polish forces, participated in the capture of Krakow, and linked up with German forces advancing from the north to complete the destruction of Polish resistance. The Polish campaign demonstrated Rundstedt's skill at coordinating large formations and executing complex encirclement operations, though it also marked the beginning of his complicity in Nazi crimes, as forces under his command participated in atrocities against Polish civilians and cooperated with SS death squads. Following the Polish victory, Rundstedt commanded Army Group A during the invasion of France in May 1940, controlling the forces that executed the decisive thrust through the Ardennes forest that trapped Allied armies in Belgium and northern France. His army group included the panzer divisions that raced to the English Channel, cutting off British and French forces in a massive encirclement that led to the Dunkirk evacuation. However, Rundstedt's role in this campaign remains controversial because of the famous Halt order that allowed British forces to escape from Dunkirk. On May 24, 1940, with German tanks just miles from Dunkirk and British forces trapped with their backs to the sea, Rundstedt ordered his panzers to halt and consolidate their positions rather than push forward to destroy the surrounded Allied armies. This decision, which Hitler later endorsed, allowed the British to evacuate over 300,000 troops from Dunkirk over the following 9 days, soldiers who would later fight in Normandy and help defeat Germany. Historians continue to debate whether Rundstedt made this decision for sound military reasons, fearing that his tanks would be vulnerable in the Flanders marshes and wanting to preserve them for the coming campaign into southern France, or whether it was a catastrophic error that changed the course of the war. Regardless, his forces eventually resumed their advance and participated in the conquest of France, earning Rundstedt promotion to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940, as part of Hitler's mass elevation of successful commanders. In 1941, Rundstedt commanded Army Group South during the invasion of the Soviet Union, leading over 1 million men in the attack on Ukraine and southern Russia. His forces captured Kiev in September 1941 in the largest encirclement battle in history, trapping over 600,000 Soviet soldiers and drove deep into Ukraine, occupying some of the Soviet Union's richest agricultural and industrial regions. However, as the campaign progressed and Soviet resistance stiffened, Rundstedt began to question Hitler's strategy of simultaneous advances on multiple axes, rather than concentrating forces for a decisive thrust on Moscow. In November 1941, during the advance on Rostov, a key city controlling approaches to the Caucasus, Rundstedt's forces briefly captured the city, but then faced a strong Soviet counterattack that threatened to encircle German forces. Rundstedt requested permission to withdraw to more defensible positions along the Mayas River, a sensible tactical decision given the overextension of German forces and the approaching winter. However, Hitler refused, insisting that Rundstedt hold Rostov at all costs, regardless of the risk. Rundstedt, displaying the independence that characterized old Prussian officers, authorized the retreat anyway, prioritizing the survival of his forces over Hitler's orders. He briefly lost his command in December 1941 for allowing the Rostov retreat, as Hitler flew into a rage and relieved him on December 1st, considering the withdrawal an act of defeatism and insubordination. The dismissal humiliated Rundstedt, who had been one of Germany's most senior and respected commanders, but events soon vindicated his judgment as the Wehrmacht went on the defensive across the entire Eastern Front. Rundstedt's dismissal proved temporary as Hitler realized he could not afford to waste experienced commanders. He was reinstated in March 1942 as Commander-in-Chief West, responsible for defending occupied France and the Atlantic coast against the anticipated Allied invasion. For over 2 years, Rundstedt oversaw the construction of the Atlantic Wall, the extensive fortification system designed to repel Allied landings, though he privately doubted whether static defences could stop a determined invasion backed by Allied air and naval superiority. As the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, executing the largest amphibious operation in history, von Rundstedt and Erwin Rommel, who commanded the forces directly facing the invasion, were assigned to contain the situation and drive the Allies back into the sea. However, von Rundstedt quickly realized the futility of their efforts as Allied forces established an unshakable beachhead and began pouring men and material into France faster than German forces could contain them. The Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies, Allied naval gunfire made it impossible to concentrate German forces near the coast, and Hitler's refusal to allow mobile defense meant that German reserves arrived piecemeal and were destroyed in detail. Rundstedt started advocating for peace, a dangerous position for any German officer to take, as Hitler viewed any suggestion of negotiation as defeatism and treason. Following a failed counterattack near Caen on July 1, 1944, which was supposed to split the Allied beachhead but instead resulted in heavy German losses, Rundstedt received a phone call from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the OKW, or German High Command. Keitel, speaking for Hitler, demanded to know what should be done about the deteriorating situation in Normandy. In response, exhausted and frustrated by Hitler's refusal to face reality, Rundstedt famously retorted with what became his most quoted statement: "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" This blunt assessment of Germany's strategic situation sealed his fate. His honest response to Keitel's question led to his removal from command the following day, July 2, 1944, as Hitler could not tolerate commanders who acknowledged that Germany was losing the war. Rundstedt was replaced by Günther von Kluge, who initially believed he could succeed where Rundstedt had failed, but who reached the same pessimistic conclusions about Germany's prospects within weeks. However, in one of the war's ironies, Hitler recalled Rundstedt once again as the commander-in-chief in the West in September 1944, recognizing that he needed experienced commanders even if they were defeatist. This third appointment placed Rundstedt in nominal command during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split Allied forces and capture Antwerp. Rundstedt opposed this operation, arguing that Germany lacked the resources for such an ambitious offensive. But Hitler overruled all objections and insisted the attack proceed. The offensive initially achieved surprise, but ultimately failed catastrophically, consuming Germany's last reserves and leaving the Western Front defenseless. Rundstedt held his position until Hitler dismissed him for the final time in March 1945, replaced by Albert Kesselring as the Western Front collapsed and Allied forces drove into the heart of Germany. On May 1, 1945, the day after Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker, troops from the American 36th Infantry Division made Rundstedt a prisoner of war at Bad Tölz in Bavaria. During his interrogation by American intelligence officers, he suffered a heart attack, likely brought on by stress and his advanced age of 69, requiring hospitalization and delaying his transfer to formal detention facilities. Von Rundstedt was moved between several detention camps in southern Wales and Suffolk in Britain, where Allied authorities held high-ranking German officers, while deciding whom to prosecute. He was charged with war crimes during the invasion of the Soviet Union by the British, who were building cases against Wehrmacht commanders for atrocities committed on the Eastern Front. The charges against Rundstedt were primarily related to his assistance in implementing Field Marshal Walther von Reichenau's notorious Severity Order, a criminal directive issued in October 1941 that called for harsh treatment of Soviet civilians and endorsed cooperation with SS killing operations. The Severity Order, which Reichenau issued while commanding the 6th Army under Rundstedt's Army Group South, stated that soldiers must show full understanding for the necessity of harsh treatment of Jews, the spiritual bearers of the Bolshevik terror, essentially authorizing Wehrmacht participation in Holocaust operations. Rundstedt had distributed this order to other units under his command as an example of proper attitude in the East, making him complicit in war crimes that led to mass murders in occupied Soviet territory. Wehrmacht units operating under Rundstedt's Army Group South had cooperated with SS Einsatzgruppen in Ukraine, providing logistical support and, in some cases, direct participation in massacres that killed tens of thousands of Jews, communists, and other targeted civilians. Documents captured by Allied forces showed that Rundstedt's headquarters had been informed of these operations and had in some cases facilitated them by providing troops and transportation. However, due to his advanced age, which was now 72, and his deteriorating health following his heart attack and years of stress, British authorities decided he was too ill to stand trial. Medical boards examining Rundstedt concluded that the stress of a war crimes trial would likely kill him, and British prosecutors were reluctant to have a defendant die during proceedings. Rundstedt was never put on trial and was released from custody in July 1948, joining a number of other elderly or infirm German officers who escaped prosecution for health reasons. The decision not to prosecute Rundstedt disappointed prosecutors who had compiled substantial evidence of his war crimes and outraged survivors who felt that age and illness should not exempt war criminals from justice. Critics pointed out that Rundstedt's health proved robust enough for him to live another 5 years after being declared too ill for trial. He spent his retirement in modest circumstances at Schloss Oppershausen in Lower Saxony, a small castle owned by distant relatives who provided him accommodation. He lived quietly, receiving visits from former Wehrmacht officers and maintaining correspondence with other retired generals who shared his conservative military outlook. Rundstedt remained continually troubled by heart conditions until his death on February 24, 1953, at the age of 77, passing away in his sleep from heart failure. His funeral was attended by former Wehrmacht officers and conservative politicians who viewed him as a symbol of traditional Prussian military values rather than as a war criminal who had escaped justice. West German authorities later provided a state funeral befitting his former rank, a decision that demonstrated how quickly German society was rehabilitating Wehrmacht commanders in the early Cold War era. Albert Kesselring held one of World War II's most diverse career paths, transitioning from Army artillery officer to Luftwaffe commander to ground forces commander in a military career that spanned multiple branches and theatres. Born on November 30, 1885 in Markstedt, Bavaria, Kesselring came from a middle-class family and entered military service in 1904, joining the 2nd Bavarian Foot Artillery Regiment. His pleasant demeanour and optimistic personality won him the affectionate nickname Smiling Albert, among those who held him in high regard, though this cheerful exterior masked a ruthless determination to achieve military objectives regardless of cost. Kesselring's military career started in World War I as an artillery officer and staff planner, where he demonstrated organisational skills and a talent for logistics that would serve him throughout his career. He continued his service into the era of the Weimar Republic, surviving the massive downsizing of the German military in the 1920s because his technical expertise made him valuable to the reduced Reichswehr. In a dramatic career shift that demonstrated his adaptability, he transferred to the newly formed Luftwaffe in 1935, taking on the challenge of helping build Germany's air force from scratch. His lack of flying experience was not considered a barrier, as the Luftwaffe needed administrators and planners as much as pilots, and Kesselring's organisational abilities made him ideal for helping create the infrastructure of a modern air force. A year after joining the Luftwaffe, he earned his stripes as a lieutenant general and became chief of the general staff of the Luftwaffe in June 1936, one of the most important positions in Germany's rapidly expanding air force. His role in developing the Luftwaffe included establishing training programs, selecting aircraft designs, and developing the tactical doctrines that would govern German air operations in the coming war. However, Kesselring clashed with Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal and Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, over strategy and aircraft development, disagreements that eventually led to his removal from the general staff position. Despite these conflicts, Kesselring retained Hitler's confidence and was given command of major air fleet formations during World War II. His role in World War II was significant, leading Luftflotte 2, Air Fleet 2 in Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain, directing thousands of aircraft in campaigns that tested German air power against increasingly capable opposition. During the invasion of Poland in September 1939, his air fleet provided close air support for advancing ground forces and conducted strategic bombing of Polish cities, demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated air-ground operations. In the Battle of France in May to June 1940, Kesselring's air fleet supported Army Group B's advance through Belgium and northern France, helping to achieve air superiority that allowed German ground forces to operate without interference from Allied aircraft. He played a crucial part in the Battle of Britain during the summer and fall of 1940, commanding bombers that attacked British airfields, radar stations, and eventually cities in an attempt to break British resistance and prepare for an invasion. However, the Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority over Britain, combined with heavy losses in aircraft and experienced aircrew, forced Hitler to postpone the invasion indefinitely, marking Germany's first major setback of the war. After the invasion of the Soviet Union began in June 1941, Kesselring initially commanded Luftflotte 2 supporting Army Group Center's drive on Moscow, but his most significant assignment came when he took up the position of Commander-in-Chief South, responsible for all German forces in the Mediterranean theatre. This position, which he assumed in late 1941, made him responsible for supporting Rommel's campaigns in North Africa, defending Italy, and coordinating with Italy's armed forces, a challenging task given the weakness of Germany's ally. Following the Allied invasions of Sicily in July 1943 and Italy in September 1943, operations that knocked Italy out of the war and brought Allied forces onto European soil, Kesselring faced the challenge of defending the Italian peninsula against numerically superior Allied forces supported by overwhelming air and naval power. He devised a defensive strategy that delayed an Allied victory for over a year, conducting a fighting retreat up the Italian peninsula that made excellent use of mountainous terrain and demonstrated his skill at defensive warfare. Kesselring organized a series of defensive lines across the Italian peninsula, including the formidable Winter Line and Gothic Line, fortified positions that took advantage of Italy's natural barriers to channel Allied advances into killing zones. His defense was so effective that Allied forces, despite their superiority in numbers and equipment, took nearly 2 years to advance from Sicily to northern Italy, tying down divisions that could have been used in France or on other fronts. However, Kesselring's defensive success came at a terrible cost to Italian civilians as German forces implemented brutal anti-partisan policies and committed numerous atrocities. Taking over as Commander-in-Chief West in March 1945, Kesselring replaced the dismissed Rundstedt and inherited responsibility for defending Germany against the final Allied offensive into the heart of the Reich. However, by this stage of the war, the situation was hopeless as Allied forces had crossed the East. Rhine River, Germany had exhausted its reserves and the Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet hammer blows. He couldn't stop the Allied push into Germany and ultimately surrendered the southern German forces on May 7, 1945, recognizing that further resistance would only result in pointless casualties. Throughout the war, Kesselring had remained loyal to Hitler, never wavering in his support for the Nazi regime even as Germany's defeat became inevitable. He was among those officers who genuinely believed in the Nazi cause rather than simply following orders out of duty. In October 1945, Kesselring was called as a witness in the Allies' first war crimes trial after the war, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, where he testified about military operations and the chain of command in the German armed forces. His testimony attempted to minimize Wehrmacht involvement in atrocities and present the German military as having fought a clean war, claims that prosecutors systematically demolished through presentation of captured documents. 2 years later, in 1947, Kesselring himself faced prosecution when a British military court in Venice put him on trial for war crimes committed in Italy. He was convicted for ordering the execution of 335 Italian civilian hostages in the Ardeatine Caves massacre that occurred in March 1944, a mass murder carried out as retaliation for an Italian partisan attack on German police that killed 33 German personnel in Rome. The massacre represented a tenfold reprisal ratio that violated the laws of war, and Kesselring's order to execute the hostages made him directly responsible for what prosecutors characterized as murder. Evidence presented at trial showed that Kesselring had personally approved the execution of Italian hostages and had failed to prevent numerous other massacres committed by German forces under his command in Italy. German troops under his authority had carried out hundreds of reprisal killings against Italian villages, executed partisans and suspected partisan supporters without trial, and participated in the deportation of Italian Jews to concentration camps. Kesselring's defense argued that partisan warfare had been brutal and that reprisals were a legitimate response to attacks on German forces, but the court rejected this argument as inconsistent with international law. Initially sentenced to death by firing squad on May 6, 1947, which prosecutors believed was appropriate given the scale of his crimes, Kesselring's sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment in 1947, after appeals to British authorities and intervention by various military figures who argued for clemency. Winston Churchill himself intervened on Kesselring's behalf, arguing that he had been a skilled and honourable opponent who should not be executed for following the harsh rules of partisan warfare. The commutation outraged Italian survivors and families of massacre victims who felt that Kesselring had escaped appropriate punishment for ordering mass murder. In another controversial decision that demonstrated the changing political climate of the Cold War, Kesselring was pardoned and released in October 1952 because of his declining health, having served only 5 years of his life sentence. Medical boards claimed he was suffering from throat cancer and other ailments that would kill him within months, justifications that proved premature as he lived another 8 years. After his release, Kesselring became actively involved in numerous veterans' associations, including serving as president of the German officers' organization Stahlhelm and becoming a prominent figure in the movement to rehabilitate the Wehrmacht's reputation. He wrote self-serving memoirs that portrayed him as a professional soldier who had tried to minimize civilian casualties and had opposed the most extreme Nazi policies, claims that historians have challenged through examination of wartime documents showing his direct involvement in war crimes. Kesselring passed away on July 16, 1960, at the age of 74, having spent his final years as a controversial figure celebrated by some Germans as a brilliant commander, but reviled by others as a war criminal who escaped appropriate punishment. Erich von Manstein is widely considered by military historians as one of the most skilled field commanders, not just of World War II, but in modern military history. A tactical genius whose brilliance on the battlefield was matched by his moral blindness to the criminal nature of the war he fought. Born Erich von Lewinsky on November 24, 1887, in Berlin, he was adopted by his aunt and uncle after his father's death and took the name Manstein, joining one of Prussia's most distinguished military families. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein started his service in World War II as the Chief of Staff to General Gerd von Rundstedt during the invasion of Poland in September 1939, where he helped plan the operational details of the campaign that crushed Polish resistance in just over a month. However, his most important contribution to German victory came during the planning phase for the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Manstein came up with a bold and innovative plan to invade France through the Ardennes forest, a strategy that was initially ignored and dismissed by the German High Command, who considered the Ardennes impassable for large armoured formations. The original German plan for invading France had been essentially a repeat of the failed Schlieffen Plan from World War I, calling for a massive right hook through Belgium that Allied commanders expected and had prepared to counter. Manstein's alternative plan called for German armour to advance through the supposedly impassable Ardennes, achieving tactical surprise and breaking through weak French defences in the sector before racing to the English Channel to trap Allied armies in Belgium. The plan was strategically brilliant, but operationally risky, as it concentrated Germany's mobile forces in a narrow sector where they could be vulnerable to counterattack. Despite initial resistance from conservative officers who considered the plan too risky, Manstein's strategy was later embraced enthusiastically by Adolf Hitler in February 1940, after Manstein personally briefed the Führer on the concept during a dinner meeting. Hitler, who fancied himself a military genius, immediately recognized the plan's potential and overruled his reluctant generals, ordering that Manstein's concept become the basis for the invasion plan. The successful execution of this plan in May 1940 resulted in France's defeat in just 6 weeks, one of history's most stunning military victories and one that vindicated Manstein's strategic vision. After commanding an infantry corps in the French assault and being promoted to general in June 1940, recognizing his contribution to the victory, Manstein's next major assignment came during the invasion of the Soviet Union. He led the 56th Panzer Corps during Operation Barbarossa, beginning in June 1941, commanding the northern pincer of Army Group North's advance that almost succeeded in capturing Leningrad in the campaign's early months. His Panzer Corps covered hundreds of miles in weeks, demonstrating the speed and tactical flexibility that made German armour so dangerous in offensive operations. After that significant achievement in the north, Manstein took command of the 11th Army on the Southern Front in September 1941, inheriting a difficult situation in the Crimean Peninsula, where Soviet forces were putting up fierce resistance. Under his leadership, the 11th Army conducted a brilliant campaign that resulted in capturing approximately 430,000 Soviet prisoners during the conquest of the Crimea, one of the largest encirclement operations of the war. Manstein's forces successfully resisted the ensuing Soviet counteroffensive at the Kerch Peninsula in early 1942, defeating Soviet attempts to relieve their besieged forces through a combination of skillful defensive fighting and well-timed counterattacks. His crowning achievement in this theatre came with the capture of the heavily fortified naval base of Sevastopol in July 1942. After a brutal siege lasting over 8 months that required innovative tactics to overcome Soviet defences built into solid rock. The victory at Sevastopol, which involved the use of massive siege artillery, including the gigantic 800mm railway gun, nicknamed Dora, resulted in his promotion to Field Marshal on July 1, 1942, making him one of the youngest officers to achieve Germany's highest military rank at age 54. Manstein's most famous operation came in the winter of 1942 to 1943, when he attempted to relieve the encircled Sixth Army trapped in Stalingrad, launching Operation Winter Storm in December 1942. Despite his best efforts and some initial tactical successes that brought his relief force to within 30 miles of the encircled city, the operation ultimately failed because Hitler refused to allow the Sixth Army to break out and link up with Manstein's forces, insisting that they hold Stalingrad at all costs. The failure to relieve Stalingrad, which resulted in the surrender of over 90,000 German troops in February 1943, marked a turning point in the war from which Germany never recovered. However, Manstein demonstrated his tactical brilliance again in February and March 1943 when he orchestrated a brilliant counter-offensive that recaptured the city of Kharkov, the last significant German victory on the Eastern Front. This operation involved a fighting retreat that lured Soviet forces into overextending their supply lines, followed by a devastating counterattack using concentrated panzer forces that encircled and destroyed several Soviet armies. The recapture of Kharkov temporarily stabilized the southern sector of the Eastern Front and bought Germany several months to prepare defenses, though it could not reverse Germany's deteriorating strategic situation. Despite these tactical successes, Manstein was eventually forced to conduct a series of fighting retreats as Soviet forces grew stronger and German resources dwindled. He was dismissed by Hitler on March 30, 1944. After repeated arguments about strategy and Manstein's insistence that Germany needed to adopt a more flexible defensive strategy rather than Hitler's rigid hold-at-all-costs approach. Hitler had grown tired of Manstein's requests for operational freedom and his frank assessments of Germany's strategic situation, preferring commanders who would execute orders without question. After the war ended, Manstein was captured by the British in August 1945 while hiding in Schleswig-Holstein under a false name, attempting to avoid capture by claiming to be a simple staff officer. He was held in various detention camps while British authorities decided whether to prosecute him for war crimes committed on the Eastern Front. In 1949, he stood trial before a British military court in Hamburg for war crimes, facing 17 charges related to his command in the Soviet Union. The charges included failure to prevent crimes against humanity committed by forces under his command, cooperation with SS Einsatzgruppen, death squads in the murder of Jews, and responsibility for the mistreatment and murder of Soviet prisoners of war. Evidence presented at trial showed that Manstein had been fully aware of mass murder operations in his command area and had in some cases facilitated them by providing Wehrmacht troops to assist SS killing squads. His 11th Army had cooperated closely with Einsatzgruppe D in the Crimea, where tens of thousands of Jews and other civilians were murdered with Wehrmacht logistical support and, in some cases, direct participation. Documents bearing Manstein's signature showed he had issued orders calling for harsh treatment of civilians and had endorsed cooperation with SS operations, contradicting his claims of ignorance. While he was acquitted of the most serious charges, specifically direct ordering of mass murders, he was found guilty on 9 counts related to failing to protect civilians, allowing his forces to cooperate with SS death squads, and responsibility for mistreatment of prisoners of war. The verdict acknowledged Manstein's extraordinary military skill while also holding him accountable for crimes committed by forces under his command. He remained imprisoned until his release due to health issues in May 1953, after serving less than 4 years of an 18-year sentence, benefiting from the Cold War politics that made West Germany's cooperation valuable to Western powers. The early release outraged many who felt that Manstein had received preferential treatment because of his military reputation and the emerging Cold War need for German military expertise. After his release, Manstein became an influential figure in West German politics and military affairs. He later served as an advisor to the West German government on army organization during the creation of the Bundeswehr in the 1950s, helping to design the structure and doctrine of West Germany's new military. His advice emphasized mobile defense, flexible command structures, and professional military leadership insulated from political interference, principles drawn from his wartime experience. His memoirs, titled Wöhlereins Siege, or Lost Victories in English, were published in 1955 and became international bestsellers, presenting his version of events on the Eastern Front. The book portrayed Manstein as a military genius who could have won the war if Hitler had given him operational freedom, a self-serving narrative that downplayed his complicity in war crimes and his own strategic errors. Historians have criticized the book for its selective presentation of facts and its attempts to rehabilitate the Wehrmacht's reputation by separating military operations from the crimes that accompanied them. Manstein remained an unrepentant nationalist who insisted until his death that he had fought honorably for Germany and that his trial had been victor's justice rather than legitimate prosecution. He passed away on June 9, 1973, at the age of 85 in Irschenhausen, Bavaria, having lived long enough to see West Germany become a prosperous democracy and NATO ally, a transformation he had helped facilitate through his post-war advisory role. Alfred Jodl represented a different type of German officer. Not a field commander, but a staff officer who wielded enormous influence through his control of operational planning at the highest levels of the German military hierarchy. Holding the rank of General Oberst, equivalent to a 4-star general in American terms, Alfred Jodl was a prominent figure in the German military during World War II, whose power derived from his proximity to Hitler rather than command of troops. Born on May 10, 1890 in Würzburg, Bavaria, into a military family, Jodl entered the Bavarian army as an artillery officer in 1910 and served with distinction during World War I. After the war, he remained in the reduced Reichswehr and slowly climbed the military hierarchy during the interwar years, developing expertise in staff work and operational planning. He served as the chief of the operations staff within the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the high command of the German armed forces, throughout the duration of World War II from 1939 to 1945, making him one of the most powerful men in Germany, despite never commanding an army in the field. His position gave him control over operational planning for all 3 branches of the Wehrmacht and direct daily access to Hitler, who increasingly relied on Jodl for military advice as the war progressed. Jodl attended Hitler's daily military conferences, presented operational plans, and transmitted the Führer's orders to theatre commanders, making him an essential link in the German chain of command. Throughout the war, Jodl proved himself a loyal Nazi and enthusiastic supporter of Hitler's aggressive policies, consistently endorsing the Führer's most extreme orders and defending them against objections from more conservative officers. He was instrumental in planning Germany's aggressive wars, working on the operational details for the invasions of Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and the Soviet Union. Unlike some Wehrmacht officers who claimed to have been apolitical professionals, Jodl was an ideological Nazi who genuinely believed in Hitler's vision of German racial supremacy and Lebensraum in the East. His loyalty to Hitler never wavered even as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated and it became clear that the war was lost. On May 7, 1945, in the immediate aftermath of Hitler's suicide, and with Germany's unconditional surrender imminent, Jodl was apprehended by British soldiers on May 23, 1945, alongside the rest of Admiral Dönitz's Flensburg government, which had briefly attempted to govern what remained of the Third Reich. He was initially confined in Camp Ashcan, a detention facility for high-ranking Nazi officials, where Allied intelligence officers interrogated prisoners about the Nazi regime's inner workings. In August 1945, he was transferred to Nuremberg to face prosecution before being presented to the International Military Tribunal at the Nuremberg trials, the landmark legal proceeding that established precedents for prosecuting crimes against peace and humanity. At Nuremberg, Jodl stood accused of scheming to perpetrate crimes against peace, planning and initiating wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, charges that encompassed the full scope of Nazi Germany's criminal conduct. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of Jodl's central role in planning aggressive wars, including captured documents showing his participation in meetings where Hitler announced plans to violate treaties and attack neighboring countries. The primary accusations tied to his name were his endorsement and transmission of the commando order issued in October 1942, which mandated the immediate execution of Allied commandos and Special Forces troops, even if they were in uniform and attempting to surrender, a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions. He was also charged with implementing the Commissar order issued before Operation Barbarossa, which mandated the immediate execution of Soviet political commissars upon their capture, another flagrant violation of international law that resulted in the murder of thousands of prisoners. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that Jodl had personally signed orders transmitting these criminal directives throughout the Wehrmacht and had defended them as military necessity. Jodl attempted to justify the 1941 mass shootings of Soviet POWs by asserting in testimony that only those prisoners who chose not to walk were executed, not those physically unable to do so, a distinction that prosecutors characterized as morally bankrupt hair-splitting that attempted to sanitize mass murder. His defense relied on arguing that he had merely been transmitting Hitler's orders and that soldiers had a duty to obey their supreme commander, arguments that the tribunal rejected as inconsistent with international law that prohibits following manifestly illegal orders. Jodl faced numerous accusations during his trial beyond the commando and commissar orders, including charges of illegal deportation of civilian populations and facilitating executions of civilians in occupied territories. Prosecutors presented evidence of his documented order to relocate Danish citizens, including Jewish individuals, to Nazi-operated concentration camps, making him complicit in the Holocaust's implementation. Documents showed that Jodl had been informed of and had approved various criminal policies in occupied territories, from the taking and execution of hostages to the destruction of entire villages in reprisal for partisan attacks. However, he successfully refuted several accusations through clever lawyering and careful examination of the documentary evidence. These included his alleged aid to Hitler in seizing control of Germany in 1933, charges the prosecution could not substantiate since Jodl had been a relatively junior officer in 1933, with no involvement in Nazi Party activities. He also successfully challenged some charges related to specific atrocities by showing that orders had been issued by other commands, or that he had not been in his position when certain events occurred. Jodl pleaded not guilty to all charges and maintained throughout the trial that he had been a loyal German officer, doing his duty, showing no remorse for his actions or acknowledgement that the orders he had transmitted were criminal. His defense attorney argued that Jodl had been a professional soldier caught between his duty to obey orders and his personal conscience, a position designed to generate sympathy but which the tribunal found unconvincing. Eventually, after months of testimony and deliberation, Jodl was found guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment, specifically conspiracy to commit crimes against peace through planning and waging aggressive war crimes through transmission of illegal orders, and crimes against humanity for his role in implementing criminal occupation policies. The tribunal concluded that Jodl bore significant responsibility for Nazi Germany's crimes, despite being a staff officer rather than a field commander, finding that his enthusiastic implementation of criminal orders made him a principal rather than merely an accomplice. He was subsequently sentenced to death by hanging on October 1, 1946, along with 11 other defendants who received death sentences, a verdict that Jodl received stoically without visible emotion. In the early hours of October 16, 1946, Jodl was executed by hanging in the Gymnasium of Nuremberg prison, one of 10 defendants hanged that night after Hermann Göring committed suicide hours before his scheduled execution. His final utterance before the trapdoor opened was spoken in German, Ich grüße dich, mein ewiges Deutschland, translating to I salute you, my eternal Germany, words that demonstrated his unrepentant nationalism and lack of remorse to the very end. The phrase became infamous as an example of Nazi defendants' refusal to acknowledge their crimes or show compassion for their victims. Jodl's execution was controversial in some German circles, where supporters argued he had merely been following orders and should not have been held personally responsible for Hitler's decisions, though legal scholars have consistently rejected this argument as inconsistent with principles of individual responsibility for war crimes. Wilhelm Keitel was one of Adolf Hitler's closest and most loyal associates, a field marshal whose complete subservience to the Führer earned him the contemptuous nickname Le Keitel, a play on his name and the German word Lakai, meaning lackey or toady. Born on September 22, 1882 in Helmscherode, Duchy of Brunswick, Keitel came from a minor aristocratic family with limited military traditions. He played a crucial role in directing the military operations of the Third Reich during the war, serving from 1938 to 1945 as the chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, effectively making him Hitler's personal military chief of staff and one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi state. However, his power was always derivative rather than independent, as he was known for his utter inability to stand up to Hitler or question the Führer's decisions. Keitel's military career during World War I mostly involved staff officer and administrative roles, rather than combat command, serving in various headquarters positions where he demonstrated organizational ability but little tactical brilliance. After Germany's defeat in 1918, he remained in the Reichswehr during the Weimar Republic, slowly advancing through various administrative and training positions. He gained promotion to Major General in October 1933, just months after Hitler came to power, and took command of an infantry division in 1934, a position he held for only a short time. It was during this time that Keitel developed a strong admiration for Hitler bordering on worship, seeing the Führer as Germany's salvation and becoming one of the most devoted Nazi officers in the Wehrmacht. From 1935 to 1938, Hitler systematically removed several generals he considered disloyal or insufficiently enthusiastic about his aggressive plans, replacing them with more compliant officers. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair of early 1938 gave Hitler the opportunity to purge conservative officers and restructure the German High Command according to his preferences. Keitel's involvement in devising a consolidated command structure that would give Hitler direct control over military planning caught the Führer's attention and demonstrated his usefulness. This led to his appointment as chief of the OKW in February 1938, a position he held until the end of World War II, making him one of the longest-serving senior officers in the Nazi regime. The position made Keitel theoretically one of the most powerful men in Germany, but in practice he functioned as Hitler's yes man, implementing the Führer's decisions without question and suppressing objections from more independent-minded generals. Following his appointment, Keitel played a significant role in bringing Austria under Nazi control through the Anschluss in March 1938, organizing the military aspects of what was presented as a peaceful union, but was actually annexation under threat of force. He also participated in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia in 1938 to 1939, helping to plan the occupation of the Sudetenland and later the seizure of the rest of the country. Keitel was deeply involved in planning the September 1, 1939 attack on Poland, which marked the beginning of World War II, working on operational details and helping to coordinate the false flag operations used to justify the invasion. In June 1940, following France's defeat, Keitel had the honour of outlining the terms of surrender to the French government in the same railroad car where Germany had signed the armistice-ending World War I, a symbolic humiliation that Hitler savoured. After Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940, along with 11 other generals, Keitel quickly began planning the invasion of the Soviet Union, working on operational details for Operation Barbarossa throughout late 1940 and early 1941. He was present at the March 30th, 1941 meeting where Hitler outlined his vision for a war of annihilation in the East, and Keitel helped transmit the criminal orders that would govern German conduct, including the Commissar Order and the Barbarossa Decree that suspended normal, legal protections for Soviet civilians and prisoners. Throughout the war, Keitel signed and transmitted numerous criminal orders, including the Night and Fog Decree that authorized the secret abduction and murder of resistance members, the Commando Order mandating execution of Allied special forces, and various directives authorizing reprisal killings of civilians. His willingness to sign any order Hitler demanded, no matter how criminal, made him an essential facilitator of Nazi war crimes. On July 20, 1944, Keitel was present at Hitler's field headquarters in East Prussia when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg detonated a bomb in an assassination attempt that came within inches of killing the Führer. Despite being present during the bombing, Keitel escaped unharmed, protected by the heavy oak conference table that deflected much of the blast. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, as confusion reigned about whether Hitler had survived, Keitel was instrumental in reasserting control and preventing the conspirators from seizing power. He led the operations to regain control over the conspirators in Berlin, working through the night to contact loyal units and order the arrest of suspects. Keitel served on the court of honor that effectively expelled many conspirators from the German military, stripping them of their ranks and protections and ensuring their conviction and death sentence by the Nazi People's Court. This kangaroo court condemned hundreds of officers to execution, often by hanging from meat hooks as Hitler had ordered, making Keitel complicit in the judicial murder of the resistance. His role in suppressing the July 20th plot further demonstrated his absolute loyalty to Hitler and his willingness to participate in the elimination of anyone who threatened the Nazi regime. Keitel was captured by the British in May 1945 in Flensburg and subsequently indicted for war crimes by the International Military Tribunal in August of the same year, becoming one of the most prominent defendants at Nuremberg. During his trial in Nuremberg, alongside other top Nazi officials, including Göring, Ribbentrop and Jodl, Keitel's war planning activities were presented as evidence of crimes against peace, and the numerous criminal orders he had issued during the war were characterized as war crimes against civilians and prisoners. Prosecutors presented stacks of documents bearing Keitel's signature, orders that had resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, making it impossible for him to deny his role in Nazi crimes. Unlike most defendants at Nuremberg who denied responsibility and claimed ignorance of criminal acts, Keitel adopted a different defense strategy that surprised prosecutors and historians. He accepted responsibility for his actions, acknowledging that he was responsible for all outcomes resulting from his signed orders, though he maintained he had been following Hitler's commands and had believed his duty as a soldier required absolute obedience. This admission of responsibility was tactical rather than moral, as Keitel showed no genuine remorse and instead presented himself as a loyal soldier who had done his duty as he understood it. His defense attorney argued that military officers could not be held criminally responsible for following their supreme commander's orders, a position the tribunal categorically rejected. In October 1946, after months of testimony and deliberation, Keitel was found guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment, specifically conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The tribunal's judgment stated that Keitel had been a willing participant in Nazi crimes rather than a reluctant follower of orders, noting his enthusiastic implementation of criminal directives and his failure to resign in protest when ordered to transmit illegal commands. He was sentenced to death by hanging, a verdict that Keitel received with apparent calm, having expected execution from the moment of his capture. Despite his request for execution by a military firing squad, which he considered more honourable than hanging, the tribunal denied this request, as hanging was the prescribed method of execution for criminals rather than soldiers. Keitel was executed by hanging on October 16, 1946, in Nuremberg prison's gymnasium in the early hours of the morning, becoming one of 10 top Nazis hanged that night. Witnesses reported that Keitel maintained military bearing as he walked to the gallows, though he stumbled slightly on the steps. His body, along with those of the other executed defendants, was cremated, and the ashes scattered in a river to prevent the creation of any shrine or memorial that might become a rallying point for neo-Nazis. Keitel's execution marked the end of a career characterized by absolute loyalty to an evil regime and complicity in some of history's worst crimes, serving as an example of how professional military competence without moral courage can facilitate atrocities. These men, from Brauchitsch to Keitel, represented the highest echelons of German military leadership during World War II, officers who commanded millions of soldiers and whose decisions affected the lives of hundreds of millions of people across Europe and beyond. Their fates after Germany's defeat varied dramatically, from execution to comfortable retirement, from long imprisonment to early death before trial. Some faced the full weight of Allied justice, standing trial for their crimes and receiving sentences that, while often controversial in their leniency or severity, represented attempts to hold military leaders accountable for their actions. Others escaped justice entirely through death, illness, or political considerations that valued their expertise or freedom over the demands of victims for accountability. The trials of German generals at Nuremberg and other tribunals established important precedents in international law, particularly the principle that following orders is not a defense for war crimes, and that military commanders bear responsibility for criminal acts committed by forces under their command. These principles have influenced military justice and international humanitarian law ever since, from the tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda to the International Criminal Court. What can we learn from examining the fates of these generals? Their stories reveal the complexities of accountability after total war, the tensions between justice and political expediency, and the difficulties of prosecuting individuals for participation in systematic crimes. Some received punishment that seemed inadequate given the scale of atrocities they enabled or committed, while others arguably faced harsher treatment than their level of culpability warranted. The variation in their sentences reflected not just differences in their individual crimes, but also the political context in which they were prosecuted, particularly the emerging Cold War that made German military expertise valuable to Western powers. The relatively lenient treatment of many Wehrmacht officers, especially compared to political leaders and SS officers, contributed to the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the false narrative that regular German military forces fought honorably while only the Nazi Party and SS committed atrocities. This myth, which German generals actively promoted in their post-war memoirs and testimony, has been thoroughly debunked by historians who have documented extensive Wehrmacht participation in war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the Holocaust. The generals discussed in this video were not apolitical professionals caught up in events beyond their control, but rather willing participants in wars of aggression and campaigns of extermination who bear significant moral and legal responsibility for Nazi Germany's crimes. Their fates also raise profound questions about the nature of duty, obedience, and moral responsibility in military hierarchies. Many of these generals defended their actions by claiming they were simply following orders or doing their duty as soldiers, arguments that the Nuremberg tribunals rejected but which continue to resonate in discussions of military ethics. The principle established at Nuremberg that individuals have a duty to refuse manifestly illegal orders, even when issued by legitimate authority, remains controversial and difficult to apply in practice. How can we expect soldiers and officers to distinguish between legal and illegal orders in the fog of war? At what point does obedience to authority become complicity in crimes? These questions, which the trials of German generals brought into sharp focus, remain relevant for modern military forces operating in complex environments where the line between lawful combat and war crimes can be blurred. The general stories also demonstrate how professional military competence and tactical brilliance can coexist with profound moral failure, as many of these men were skilled commanders whose abilities were employed in service of a genocidal regime. The contrast between these generals and their Allied counterparts is striking and worth examining. While German generals faced prosecution and imprisonment, many Allied commanders who also presided over controversial actions received honours and comfortable retirements. This discrepancy reflects not just victors' justice but fundamental differences in the nature of the wars being fought. The Allied commanders, despite controversial decisions like the bombing of Dresden or the use of atomic weapons on Japan, were fighting to defeat fascism and end Nazi genocide, whereas German generals were implementing wars of aggression and racial extermination. This moral distinction, while sometimes uncomfortable to acknowledge given the human costs on all sides, remains central to understanding why the fates of Axis and Allied commanders diverged so dramatically. It's also worth considering what happened to the junior officers and enlisted men who served under these generals. While the field marshals and generals faced trials and imprisonment, millions of ordinary German soldiers returned home to rebuild their lives with little accountability for their participation in the war. Many Wehrmacht veterans integrated successfully into post-war German society, some rising to prominent positions in West Germany's government, military and business sectors. This widespread amnesty for ordinary soldiers, while perhaps necessary for German society to function, meant that many individuals who had participated in atrocities escaped accountability entirely. The focus on prosecuting top leaders while allowing lower-ranking participants to escape punishment remains controversial, raising questions about how societies should balance justice with reconciliation after mass crimes. The influence of these generals extended beyond their lifetimes through their memoirs, testimony, and the networks of former officers who preserved and promoted their version of history. Many wrote self-serving accounts that minimized Wehrmacht crimes and portrayed themselves as professional soldiers who had opposed Hitler's worst excesses, narratives that significantly shaped public understanding of the war for decades. Their memoirs became bestsellers in Germany and were widely read by military historians, influencing military doctrine and strategy during the Cold War. Only in recent decades have historians systematically challenged these accounts by examining captured German documents, survivor testimony, and evidence from Soviet and Eastern European archives that were inaccessible during the Cold War. This research has fundamentally revised our understanding of Wehrmacht crimes and the complicity of professional military officers in Nazi atrocities. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and eye-opening. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic and the surprising fates of these unbelievable World War II generals, make sure to check out our video about what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II, which explores another fascinating dimension of how the Third Reich's collapse affected those connected to its leadership. These stories of accountability, escape, and the long shadow of the Nazi regime continue to shape our understanding of justice and responsibility in warfare. Don't forget to like this video if you found it educational, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into World War II history, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more fascinating content about the people and events that shaped the 20th century's most devastating conflict. Your support helps us continue researching and producing these detailed historical documentaries. Drop a comment below, letting us know which general's fate surprised you the most, or if there are other World War II topics you'd like us to cover in future videos. See you in the next one.